Okay, now we're going to talk about scientific inquiry. Parts of scientific inquiry, it's asking questions. Inquire is to be curious, to try to figure out the why something is happening. And there are different methods that scientists use to figure out that why. One is the scientific method, and then in the process of the scientific method, you do experiments and use various measurement tools with those experiments, along with other important information that you gather from other scientists. So first we want to ask, what is science? Science is the study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observations and experimentation. In order to figure out the answers to questions that exist in science, scientists use research that they learn through their experiments as well as experiments that other scientists have used. And experiments are set up in a very methodical, systematic way. It's a step-by-step procedure that always has the same basic structure that scientists follow when doing experiments. Can you name any scientists at all? What do you think makes them scientists? Could you be considered a scientist? Well, the answer to the last question is yes. Anytime you look at a problem and you try and figure out the solution, you either consciously or subconsciously, in order to solve that problem or that question, use steps of the scientific method to do that. So in essence, you are all scientists. And once you can either click on the link about famous scientists and you can look at those and see if you recognize any scientists. It would be great to go and see if there are any. There's a huge list, A through Z, in all sorts of areas: biology, chemistry, physics. There's just a lot of different names of the scientists that exist there, and see if you do recognize any of them. But we are going to go through a couple that you may or may not recognize, but when you put the name with the face, I think you will have heard of them before. So when you look at these scientists, the ones on the left, the three of them, the three men, we will be talking about in great deal in various parts of sixth grade science. The ones on the right, we really won't touch on, but they're just interesting scientists to look at because they've made major contributions to the scientific world. All right, these scientists on the upper left is Madame Curie. Madame Curie actually worked with radiation. She worked to develop the ability to use radiation for X-ray and actually died from her exposure to the radiation. We probably won't talk about her much again this year, but the other three scientists on this page we will talk about again. Sir Isaac Newton, and we'll talk about him during the Force and Motion book, and Galileo and Copernicus, we'll talk about both of them in the Space and Astronomy books. Sir Isaac Newton discovered the laws of motion, the law of gravity. Many of the laws of physics were Sir Isaac Newton's discoveries. Galileo, he's considered the father of the scientific method. He also took information from other scientists, particularly those from the Netherlands, and then worked really hard to develop the art of crafting lenses. And then he used that craft to develop telescopes in which he was able to discover many of the planets that are closer to us. Copernicus, also important in space and science, he developed the helio, meaning the sun, centric, meaning the center, the heliocentric concept of that model being that the sun is the center of our universe versus us being the center of our universe. This is Alexander Graham Bell, and Alexander Graham Bell's invention was the telephone, not a cell phone, but the kind of telephones that are like connected to walls. It used to be that we had telephone lines and the information went through those lines, not the internet or Wi-Fi or cell towers. It actually went through telephone lines, and that was the type of telephone that he discovered, which then led to the development of other types of phones. And what's important about these three scientists, Watson and Crick, Erwin Chargaff, and Rosalind Franklin, are that without each other, we would not have been able to discover, or they would not have been able to discover, the structure of DNA, which then leads to all sorts of advancements in science that have happened since then. Watson and Crick were originally given the credit for discovering the double helix, or the shape of the DNA molecule. However, they could not have discovered that if it were not for the X-ray pictures that Rosalind Franklin took of DNA that showed the picture of how the molecule was put together, and Chargaff, who discovered how the parts that make up the rung of the ladder of the DNA, how they fit together. So without those two pieces, it would not have been able to have been put together in the double helix that we know of that makes up DNA. So that just shows that scientists need to report their information factually so that other scientists can use that information to be able to also apply that to their research that they're doing or their experiments that they're doing in order to come up with a conclusion together, actually. When you do experiments, you need to realize a few things. First of all, every lab that we do, every experiment that we do, or that anyone would ever do, has to have a purpose. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to look and you're going to say, I wonder why that works. You're going to ask that question. And then the purpose of that experiment is to answer that question. So every lab must have a purpose. The other important thing is that you need to realize that when you're doing a lab, and you're going to see this when we do the gizmos coming up, when you do a lab, it's important that you only test one thing at a time. For instance, if you were growing plants and you wanted to see if a certain type of fertilizer made those plants grow better than without fertilizer, you would only be testing the fertilizer. Both plants would have to receive the same amount of sunlight, be planted in the same kind of soil, be the same kind of plants, be in the same temperature, get the same amount of water, get the same amount of sunlight. All parts need to be exactly the same, and the only thing you're testing is one thing. And in this case, it would be the fertilizer on the soil. The reason that is because if you didn't do it that way, and let's say you changed the fertilizer, but you also watered one plant more than the other, and let's say that the one plant that got the fertilizer and more water grew faster than the one that didn't, you wouldn't know if it was the fertilizer that caused that plant to grow or the additional water. So you only test one thing. That one thing you're testing is called the independent variable. It has several other names. It can also be called the manipulated variable or the experimental variable. The result that you look for, the thing that when you're comparing that plant and you're looking at it and you're saying, okay, that grew 2 inches, that grew 4 inches. That result from the thing you're testing, the thing you're observing, that is your responding or your dependent variable. And all things have to be compared with something called a control. If you don't have a control or something to compare with, you don't know if there is a change or not. So you always have to have a control. One variable, one control, and then one independent variable, one thing you're testing, one control, and then how it responds is your dependent variable. So the terms you need to know are independent variable, which is also known as manipulated or experimental. It's the one thing being tested, only one per experiment. Dependent variable, also known as the responding variable, is the result, is what you observe. And then the controlled variable is the thing that it is compared to. So it gives you a constant thing to be compared to. It's also known as the constant. Okay, when scientists actually get their final results that they've observed, they have to have a way to measure them, so that they know what they're looking at and what has actually happened. And the measurements have to all be in a common language so that scientists across the world, even though they don't speak the same language, can understand the data that they see. So the information is written into the International System of Units, which is abbreviated SI. And all SI units are done in the metric system. So for length, we're going to be meters, centimeters, millimeters, kilometers, etc. For volume, it's going to be milliliters and liters. For mass, it's going to be grams and kilograms, etc. So in measuring length, you're going to use a meter stick or a ruler. Again, you're going to use the metric system, so you have to make sure that if you've got the ruler, you have it flipped to the right side and you're using the centimeter and millimeter side. Same with the meter stick. You have to make sure you're not using a yardstick side of it, you're using the meter stick side of it. And if you look at it, you can see it goes, the ruler, the green little piece up there, it goes 0, 1, 2, 3. Those are the centimeters. And the little lines in between, those are the millimeters. And it takes 10 millimeters to make up 1 centimeter. So there's 10 little lines between 0 and 1. And 1 to 2, there's 10 more. For volume, that's your liquid measure. You're going to use glassware like that's in that picture, and it has graduated lines on it that are measurement lines, like on a ruler. And you're going to measure the milliliters or the liters. And you're going to look and you're going to see what the volume, that just like a measuring cup in your kitchen, if you get a cup of water, instead you're going to do 10 milliliters of water. Or if you're measuring a solid, regularly shaped object, you can use, like this cube here, you can use the formula length times width times height, like you had in math, and you would end up with, in this case, it's measuring centimeters, so it would be cubic centimeters. For mass, in science we do mass, not weight. Mass is the amount of matter that makes up an object. You're going to use a balance to measure the mass. And the mass is typically going to be done in kilograms or grams. The balance on the left, it's called a balance, not a scale. The balance on the left is a triple beam balance, and there aren't many times that you probably will use a triple beam balance, but it's important to know how to use one, because some labs, that's what they have in them instead of the balance, like the one that's on the right. It's called a digital balance. Those are the ones that we have here. Most likely that is the kind you will be able would see and use, but in case you come across a triple beam balance, you need to be able to do that. The one on the right is the digital one, and that one is really a simple one, and that's the one, like I said, we're going to be using in lab. There are other tools that aren't here. Some examples would be a thermometer, a stopwatch, a telescope. Those are all tools that scientists use. So we're going to end this session, and I will talk with you again when we get to the next one.